Greetings, I'm Professor K, and in this short video presentation, we're going to see how we go about preparing our Server 2016 for promotion to a domain controller. For this lab, I will be using the latest version of VirtualBox along with the extension pack for that version. Now, you're free to use any emulation software you want. You can do this in Hyper-V, you can do this with VMware, or as I'm doing it, you can use VirtualBox. I have one virtual install of Server 2016 that I will be using for this demonstration. This is a clean install. It is currently configured as a default server. In our previous lab, we got to see the importance of why we have to have a good plan and a good design in place before we proceed on with creating our domain controllers or adding machines to the network. This is critical because later on, 6 months from now, or a year from now, if you do not have a good plan in place, you may find yourself in a predicament where you're going to have to rebuild or redesign your domain because the IP addressing is no longer conducive to a good network design. In this video presentation, I'm going to show you how to use Server Manager as a one-stop shop for all the things that you have to configure before you promote this server to a domain controller. Now in the lab file, I show you how to do everything using the long way home. I'm going to show you how to find these same items that are inside of our Server Manager individually up inside of Server 2016. Let's take a look at my network configuration up inside of VirtualBox. Now when I'm doing a lab environment, I don't want my lab to interfere with my private network or my work network. So I'm going to isolate it using a host-only adapter. So to do this, I'm going to go up to Devices, I'm going to go to Network, I'm going to click on Network Settings. And from the options that I have for attaching to, I'm going to pull down that window and I'm going to select Host-Only Adapter. This is going to isolate my machine from my private network. So any other machines that I need to connect to this server once it is a domain controller will also have to have their network adapter up inside of VirtualBox configured for host-only adapter. Take note that when you are configured with a host-only adapter, that your network connection is going to indicate that there's no internet access. That's what you want, because you do not want your machines in your lab environment updating from the Microsoft Update site because you don't have enough disk space to handle all those updates. If this were a working environment, I would have my network adapter configured for either NAT or for bridge networking. So currently this machine is picking up its IP address from the DHCP server built into VirtualBox. And so that we can see that IP address that is currently assigned, I can go down here to my search window, I can type in CMD, and I can just hit enter. That brings up a command prompt, and at the prompt I can type in ipconfig. I can hit enter, and you'll see that I have an IP address of 192.168.56.131. Now these first 3 octets represent the network. This last octet represents the IP address assigned to the host. And every device on the network must have its own IP address. I cannot reuse 131 for a printer or for a host machine. That IP address is particular to this server. Now to help keep things simple, if you prefer, you are free to use this IP address that is currently assigned to your machine when it comes time for you to statically configure your installation of Server 2016. I prefer to use a block of IP addresses that are set aside or reserved for my different types of devices on the network. And if this was my server, I would start it off with a .10. So I'm going to go ahead and use my design of 192.168.145.10 when I'm configuring this particular server to be promoted to a domain controller. And let's see how we do this using Server Manager. Now to do this, I'm just going to go down here to my IP4 address assigned by DHCP. I'm going to double click it. Inside of Network Connections, I'm going to locate my Ethernet adapter, right click, and from the context menu, select Properties. up inside of my network properties, I'm going to locate Internet Protocol version 4 and double click. Now currently, since we're configured for DHCP, I do not have a static IP address assigned. Now to do this, I'm going to go ahead and check the radio button to use the following IP address. So my first octet is going to be 192, next octet 168, then my third octet will be 145, and the IP address that I'm going to assign to this server will be 10. I hit my tab key, come down to the next block, and it's automatically going to give me a Class C subnet mask. That's what I want. I can go ahead and leave out the default gateway, or if I want, I can assign the default gateway as being the same IP address that I have assigned to the server, but it's not necessary. Now we have to configure the DNS server. Now currently, this machine is not a domain controller, so it doesn't have DNS installed. But when you get ready to promote this machine, it's going to discover that it does not have DNS installed, and it's going to want DNS installed before it will allow you to install Active Directory. So you can go ahead and you can configure this machine now with the loopback address of 127.0.0.1. Now this loopback address tells the machine to look locally for its DNS information. That's all it means. So we don't want this machine to query the network for a DNS server because it is going to be the DNS server. And that's why we configure it for the loopback address. So it will look locally at itself. Go ahead and say OK to that. Say OK to that. Go ahead and close out that. Back inside our server manager, we can double click where we see our server name, and you can click on the change button, and now you can change this name to something more conducive, more user-friendly, so you can readily identify this machine up inside of your network when you see it. So I'm going to call this one DC1. You can call your machine anything you want, but you should have a naming convention for your servers, for your workstations, for your printers, so that they can easily be identified if you see those up inside of DHCP or you see them up inside of Active Directory. You should be able to identify that machine as being a server, a workstation, a printer, or whatever the device is. So I'm now going to go ahead and say OK. And it tells me I must restart for the changes to take effect. I'll say OK to that. I'll say close. And it wants to do a restart. But before I do that, I'm going to close out all my windows. That's going to allow the machine to power down gracefully and to restart without any issues. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Restart Now. And when we come back up, we'll see that our machine has a static IP address and has been renamed. We're back up to the desktop. My server manager has loaded. And if I go over here to the left window pane, I can click on Local Server. And underneath Local Server, you see that we now have a computer with a name of DC1, and it is statically configured with the IP address of 192.168.145.10. So in this short video presentation, you got to see why we need to configure our server with a static IP address and assign it a user-friendly name before we promote it to a domain controller. Now, before you can add any other machines to the network, such as your Windows 10 machine, you're going to have this machine installed, configured correctly, and promoted to a domain controller, and then you can move on to adding your devices to your new domain. You got questions? You got concerns? Please don't hesitate to reach out, contact your instructor, and I'll see you in my next video.